You can't read anything about the First World War and the Western Front without coming across the name the Somme. The Somme River Valley is extremely picturesque, winding its way for about 50 kilometres between the ancient cities of Amiens and Saint-Quentin. But sadly, in both British and Australian history, the Somme is a name that could be used as a synonym for the devil himself.
It wasn't long after the Australian troops began to land here in northern France that the Commander-in-Chief of all the British forces, General Sir Douglas Haig, decided he wanted a breakthrough. And so July and August became the Battle of the Somme, and it really is the darkest piece of British military history. And sadly, Australia has her part in that as well. I'm just north of the town called Pozieres, and behind me is the site of the windmill. And rather than get into all the battle details of everything that happened on this ridge, I'd rather read what's written behind me on this stone. The ruin of Pozieres windmill, which lies here, was the centre of the struggle in this part of the Somme battlefield in July and August 1916. It was captured on August the 4th by Australian troops, who fell more thickly on this ridge than on any other battlefield of the war.
In the battles around here, the number of Australian casualties became well over 23,000. The official historian Charles Bean wrote, "There is no other piece of ground in the world that is sown with so much Australian blood." Some of the veterans said it made Gallipoli look like a picnic. That was mid-1916. And over the next 2 years that followed, the Australian troops continued to further the name we honour today, called Anzac. Places like Bullecourt, Messines, Passchendaele are all towns that you can visit today. But back then they were muddy, bloody battlefields that spoke more of pain and suffering than glory and victory. The heads, well, they called it the War of Attrition. That is, a stalemate, where both sides were trying to outlast each other. What this meant is lives were lost, wounds were inflicted, and minds shattered, all for no real gain. Each would claim victory was near, yet there was little to offer as any proof. French soldiers began to mutiny, British politicians and generals were sacked and replaced, but still the stalemate dragged on.
One of the Anzac traits that I love the most is the dry sense of humour that comes out in the weirdest of times and circumstances. This is the small town of Albert. It's on the edge of the Somme Valley, and Australians were constantly being marched in and out and through this town right throughout their stay in France. Now behind me in the distance you can see this massive cathedral, and right on top of it still today is this statue of the Virgin Mary holding up the baby Jesus. Now a shell had hit it in 1916 before the Aussies got here, and it was lying off on this precarious angle, but it didn't break and fall to the ground until a few years later. So when the Aussies first marched through, they looked up and saw it, and they called the statue Fanny Durack. Now Fanny Durack was a champion Australian Olympic swimmer of the time, and they looked up and figured it looked like the Virgin Mary was taking a dive, so she got the name Fanny Durack.
Albert, or Albert as the locals pronounce it, is a beautiful little French town that lives up to everything your imagination can picture about little French towns. And although it was tempting, I didn't stay there long because it made more sense to take the 20-minute train journey down to the larger city of Amiens. It's quite ironic, but that's exactly how the German army felt in 1918. It was in March that they made their great breakthrough and smashed the British lines, and their major objective was to take the city of Amiens. Just a few minutes after leaving Albert, the train speeds over an embankment near the village of Dernancourt. It was here that Anzacs put up a great fight against the German advance, but for a terrible cost of lives. There was a genuine concern by now that if the Germans continued their advance, all the Allied forces in the north would be cut off, and this would pretty much lose them the war. So you can imagine the intensity of the situation as the minutes, hours and days went on without there being a decisive Allied victory.